You have a lot of different fabrics in your kit this month. Yours are going to be labeled either block G or block H. On this side, those are all block G, and on this side, those are all block H. We're going to cut the red piece down for block G into a 2x2 square. So as always, we're going to clean cut 2 edges, either rotate the fabric, or if you're using a small mat, rotate that. Then I'm lining my 2-inch mark. I could have done it with the 10-inch too. My 2-inch mark on one side and the other that I clean cut already. And when you're sure you have it, we're going to cut off the last 2 edges. From the gold, or in our case, it's more of a cheddar, we are going to cut 4 pieces that are 2 by 3.5. So if I add all those measurements up, I need a rectangle to start that's 8 by 3.5. So I want the 8 going this way. Again, clean cutting 2 edges. Rotate. I want my 8-inch mark on my short edge and my 3.5-inch mark on my long edge. And cut. Oh, and I did forget to mention, I've already sprayed all my things. I did tell you I wasn't going to show you that every month. Now we're going to just start backing this ruler off in 2-inch increments. So I'm going to back it off to the 6-inch mark. And again, I have straight lines lined up with my long edges so that I keep everything straight. And cut. Back it up another 2 inches to the 4-inch mark. And cut, and then the 2-inch mark, and cut, and there are my 4 gold or cheddar rectangles. My beige rectangles I'm going to cut down into 2 2 3/4-inch squares. So if I add 2 3/4 together, it's going to be 5.5 inches. So I want to make sure I'm going to be able to get a 5.5-inch piece out of here, and I can. I am cutting all of mine at once. If you are not comfortable doing that, then by all means cut them one at a time. So again, I'm clean cutting 2 edges. And I'm working on a stack, so now I'm definitely going to rotate the mat rather than the stack of fabric so that it doesn't shift. So then I want to line up my 2 3/4-inch mark with my long edge and my 5.5-inch mark with my short edge that I just cut and straightened. And then I'm going to back my ruler up to 2 3/4 on the short edge and cut, and because I had all 4 stacked up, I have all 8 squares cut. But again, if you're not comfortable with them in a stack, cut them one at a time. I'm going to do exactly the same thing with my green rectangles. I need 2 2 3/4-inch squares from each. I did want to mention, if you're stacking them, what I did was try to line up 2 edges as close as possible before I clean cut. That way I know I'm taking the least amount off the edges that I'm clean cutting, and I should have plenty on the rest of it to finish it. So again, I'm clean cutting 2 edges, and then I'm going to rotate my mat. And again, 2 3/4 times 2 is 5.5. So I'm lining up the 2 3/4 mark on the long straight edge and the 5.5 mark on the short edge, and cut. When you're cutting through several layers, you're going to want to make sure you have a nice sharp blade if you choose to do that. And I'm going to back my ruler up to the 2 3/4 mark and cut. And there's my 8 green squares. On the back of every single one of the beige triangles, we're either going to draw a line from corner to corner one direction on the squares, or if you got the magic wand, use that. I don't have one handy for filming. We sold all of them last month, including the one I was demoing. So either one line point to point, or put your magic wand down with the line lining up corner to corner and mark the 2 lines. After you've marked the wrong side of all your beige backgrounds, you're going to match the beige backgrounds with the green squares. And depending on how you marked it, if you marked it with a single line, you're going to sew 1/4 inch away from that line on each side. If you marked it with the magic wand, you're going to sew on the lines. I am matching up the same beige with the same green, but you certainly don't have to. It will be more scrappy looking if you don't. Here are my squares, and I've chain pieced them. I've sewn 2 lines on every square, and now we're just going to cut these squares apart. And because mine are chain pieced, they're all still attached. You can use scissors or a rotary cutter to cut them apart. So you're just going to cut all of them apart. The pattern calls for a triangle square up ruler. I do not have one, and I was not familiar with it, but I pulled up a video and watched it. If you have one, feel free to use it, but it is squaring up the triangles or the squares before they're pressed. I would rather press and then square up my square, because that way I'm sure that I'm not taking up any extra in my pressing. So cut all these apart, and then we're going to press the seam toward the dark. Well, now we have 16 of these green and beige squares. We need to trim all the squares down to 2 inches square. And you can do it with just a regular square ruler. You could do it with a rectangle too if you want, but the line wouldn't be in exactly the right spot. I'm lining up the 45-degree line with my seam allowance. And I'm going to clean cut 2 edges. And then I'm going to rotate the piece, and I'm going to line up my 2-inch mark on my ruler with the 2 edges I just cut. And again, I'm keeping that 45-degree line in the middle. That helps keep everything straight. And I'm going to cut. Okay, we are ready to sew our half square triangles into pairs, and if you will lay them out like this, all the pairs get sewn together exactly the same way. So once I've sewn them together, if I take this pair and rotate it, I do get my pinwheel block. So what I would recommend you do is make a stack like this at your sewing machine. So you know you just flip that one over on top of that one and sew the 1/4 inch. So I will show you that after I have done it. Here's my half square triangle sewn together. I forgot to mention before I went to sew, when you put these together, the seams are opposing, so they lock right together, so that helps keep everything straight. Once you have sewn them all together, we're going to press toward the green triangle on the seam so that we have a piece that looks like this. Now I just need to cut them apart. And we're going to match the pairs up like this. Our seams are going to be opposing each other, so that's going to help us to line it up. If you want to be extra sure, then put a pin down through where your point is on one side. So we're going to check. So there it is. And then in through the point on the other side. So they're straight up and down. And again, your seams are going in opposite directions, so they should line up there. And then you can either put a pin on each side of this pin, take as small a bite as you can to hold it, and then pull this pin out, or you can use a fork pin in here, which is just a pin, there's a lot of seams in there, a pin that has 2 points on it. And we're going to sew all those together. I do like to make sure that when I'm sewing that I hit that point right there so that I keep my points in the center of my pinwheel. Here are my pieces sewn together. Now if I was just to press my seam to one side, I have 8 pieces of fabric coming into this center point. It's going to be a huge bulky seam allowance on one side. So what I'm going to do is pop the stitches. So this is where I sewed last. I'm going to take this up and I'm going to twist there at the center. It will only work one direction, and the couple of the stitches will pop out of my previous seam so that I can open this up and I get a little tiny pinwheel right here in the center. So then I can press with my seams doing a pinwheel. So it will only pop one way. If I try to go the opposite direction, it just twists on itself. So this is a seam I sewed right here. I'm going to twist and it will pop a couple of stitches. You don't need to clip them. And it presses open. If you can't get that pop to work for you, then you could press this seam allowance open all the way. So my pinwheel blocks are finished. There's the back. So it just spreads that bulk on all four sides if you split your seam. I'm ready to start putting my block together now in rows. So I will put each pinwheel together with a cheddar rectangle into one row, and then the red piece with two cheddar rectangles on the opposite sides of it, and sew them together. And in all cases, I'm going to be pressing toward the cheddar rectangle. I didn't talk at all about arranging your pinwheels. You can put any arrangement you want. I kind of took the two darkest and put them on opposite corners and the two lightest on opposite corners. My rows are sewn together. I press toward the cheddar, and now to finish the block off, we're just going to sew the 3 rows together. Because we press toward the cheddar in each row, we have our seam allowances going in opposite directions. So they should interlock and make it easy to sew. I didn't mention before I went off to sew that I sew with this strip on top because there's a point here and a point here that I want to make sure I'm hitting the intersection, and there aren't any points on here. It's just those seams that I'm matching. So once I have sewn it all together, my seams again are pressed in toward the cheddar pieces. There's less bulk there, so that's usually what I'm looking for. And that is our finished Grandma's Choice block. Our next block for this month is the Hayes Corner block. The first thing we're going to do is take our green square and our goldish brown square and cut both of them down to 3 1/4 inches square. So I'm going to once again just stack them on top of each other. I'm clean cutting 2 edges. And you don't have a ton extra, so make sure when you're clean cutting that you are not taking off too much or cleaning your edges. I'm actually walking around the piece this time because I didn't put it on a smaller mat. Because since they're stacked, I don't really want to pick them up. So 3 1/4, 3 1/4, and trim off those last 2 edges. On the back of the gold square, we're going to mark it for sewing on two lines on the back for a half square triangle. So again, if you have the magic wand, you're going to line it up with the lines corner to corner, or a ruler and mark 1 line. The magic wand, you're going to sew on your drawn lines. If you're doing it with a ruler, you're going to sew a 1/4 inch away from that line on both sides. Then we are going to match that gold piece up with our green piece, right sides together, and sew a 1/4 inch on each side or on the lines if you marked with your magic wand. After I've sewn, once again, I'm going to cut it in half between my stitched lines, and this time I'm going to press toward the green triangle. It probably doesn't make a huge amount of difference which way you press it. We need to trim these half square triangle units down to 2 1/2 inches. So if you're using a regular ruler, once again, line up that 45-degree line, clean cut 2 edges, then rotate and cut it down to the 2 1/2. From my black strip, I need 2 strips or 1 1/2 inches wide, so I need to clean cut at least 1 long edge. You don't really have to clean cut the short edge, but I went ahead and did it. Going to rotate it. 1 1/2 times 2 is 3 inches. So I'm going to cut a 3-inch strip. And then back off to 1 1/2. Keep one of those strips whole. From the other one, I want to cut a piece that is about 3 and 3/4 long. Save the 3 3/4 piece. This piece is scrap. This golden brown strip, we want to cut it into a 1.5 inch strip. We're not worried about the short ends being straight at this point, so I'm going to clean cut one edge, rotate, line up my 1.5 inch mark, and cut. Then I'm going to take these two longer 1.5 inch pieces and sew them together, right sides together, so I should end up with a 2.5 inch strip. From this piece that is now 2.5 inches wide, we need to get 3 pieces, 3 strips going this way that are 1.5 inches. So I'm going to line up a line on my seam in the middle, and you should also have lines lining up on your cut edges on the outside. I'm going to cut off one end, rotate. 1.5 times 4 is 6 inches. So I'm going to line up again the middle line here, my cut edges, and the 6 inch mark here on the end, and cut. Then 6 inches minus 1.5 is 4.5. I'm going to slide back to my 4.5 inch mark. Cut back to my 3 inch mark. Cut, and my 1.5 inch mark. And cut. So there's my 4 strips. I'm going to take those 4 pieces that I just cut and sew them together into 4 patch units. So right sides together, and the seams are going opposite directions, so that'll lock, and just sew a seam allowance. You can press that seam to one side if you want to. I prefer to pop my seams because it always gives me a nice flat intersection. So again, this is the last seam I sewed. It will only pop one way, that way it doesn't pop. If I twist this way, then the couple stitches pop out there, and I get, so I can press, again having sort of a pinwheel effect on my seam allowances. When I press it, because it's a 4 patch, I get a nice little 4 patch here in the center. Now I'm ready to cut down my last beige piece. Your pattern calls it beige green. There's no green in yours. It's just the kind of the bigger beige rectangle with vines in it. So I'm going to clean cut 2 edges. And you are going to want to pay attention to the diagram. The first cut I'm going to make is going to be 3.5 inches across the widest part of the rectangle, and I didn't clean cut those 2 edges yet. So I'm going to cut it at 3.5, and then this section should be 3 inches. So I'm going to cut it at 3. All the way across. Then from my 3.5 inch piece, I'm going to cut a piece that is 3.5 inches wide, because 1.5 plus 1.5 equals 3. So I've got a line up here, here, and this was the edge I had clean cut. So here at 3.5, I'm going to cut it off. I'm going to back my ruler up to 1.5 inches. Again, I make sure I keep a line on the other 2 cut edges so that I keep everything straight. So there's 1.5. So there's, oops. That one was 1.5. Somebody wasn't paying attention. 1.5. This is supposed to be 3 3/4. I'm still good because I oversized, so it's 1.5, but I don't need it to be 1.5 anymore, but it's 3 3/4 long. and I want to cut this strip, so it's 3 3/4 this way, and I want to cut it down to 2.5 inches this way. So fortunately, I oversized those rectangles again. So again, be really careful, pay attention to the diagram. See what I just did to mess up. Okay, so out of this last piece, we want 2.5 inch sections going this way. So we're going to go to 5 inches first. This piece on this end is scrap. We're going to back up to 2.5 inches. And if I don't move those squares, then now I can divide this. It was 3 inches. We're going to divide it into 1.5. So I have 2.5 by 1.5 inch rectangles. Okay, we have our beige piece that was 3 3/4 this way and 2.5 this way, and then we have that one black piece that we cut. It's 3 3/4 this way, and it was, I believe, it was 1.5 inches this way. We're going to sew them together, right sides together. This piece should measure 3.5 inches this way. From this strip, we're going to cut 2 1.5 inch strips going that way. So again, I'm going to line up a line on my seam. You want to make sure you're getting 3 inches out when you clean cut one edge. And to rotate it. Line up my 3 inch line down here. I have a line again on the seam and on the edges. Cut. Move back to the 1.5 inch mark. And cut. To the bottom of both 4-patch units, we're going to sew a 1.5 by 2.5 inch beige piece. Do make sure that your 4 patches are oriented the same way. You don't want it like this. You want to make sure that your black pieces are in the upper left-hand corner on both. But it does show that in the pattern, so just pay attention to that. Okay, I pressed this time toward the 4-patch. Then we're going to take our strips that we just cut the last time, and they are going to go on the right side of this, like that. So we press toward the 4-patch. In this case, we press toward the black. So again, our seams are going to be going in opposing directions. We're going to sew that onto the edge. Do pay attention to which side you're putting it on. After that, sewing that strip on, we're going to press toward the strip and set those pieces aside. You need to get your half square triangles back out, or units back out, and we are going to sew a beige piece to the bottom of the green side. So you want the green pointing to the bottom left-hand corner and the gold is pointing to the top right-hand corner, and you're going to sew the pieces on there. After sewing this piece on, we're pressing toward the beige strip away from the half square triangle. Then we're going to take our last strips of the beige background and add it to the left side of this unit, so it's getting sewn to the green triangle. 2 pieces I pressed toward the tan strip that I just added. Now that we have 4 squares, it's time to put them together into the block. Make sure your green triangles are pointing out toward the corners. And then we're going to have a chain with our black strips going this way. So the beige will be on the inside on the 4-patch blocks and on the outside on the half square triangle blocks. So we're just going to sew them together, right sides together into rows. I like to sew with my half square triangle unit on the top so that I can see this spot right here so that I get that point sewn in. Once they're sewn together in pairs, press the seam toward the half square triangle unit. And now, because they're both going towards the half square triangle units, the seams are going in opposite directions. So I'm going to sew the 2 rows together, and those seams are going to nest. Here's the finished block. It should measure 6.5 inches at this point. The pattern says to press that last seam to one side. I chose instead to split it in the center again, just like we've been doing all along this month. So I get this little tiny 4 patch here in the middle, and I get a nice flat intersection in the middle.